Amarachi was 20 years old when her parents forced her to marry Richard, a 45-years-old man who was much older than her, but her parents had insisted that marrying him was the best decision for the family. Richard was rich and well-respected, and in their eyes, that was all that mattered to them. Amarachi had hoped that with time, she would grow to love him. But years had passed, and instead of love, she felt only growing resentment toward him. Amarachi had the finest things. She wore the best cloth, drove the best cars, expensive jewelry, and trips around the world. But none of it could make her heart soften toward her husband Richard. She felt trapped in a golden cage, forced to play the role of a loving wife, while secretly wishing for a different life. Richard treated her well, but his presence suffocated her. Richard was nothing like the man she dreamed of marrying. Although he was rich, but she didn't care much about his money. Richard was controlling, always making the decisions, never asking her for her opinion. Even when she smiled in public, deep inside, she longed for freedom. Whenever she looked at herself in the mirror, all she saw was a young woman wasting away in a marriage she never chose. She knew she couldn't leave. Divorce would shame her family, and she would lose the luxurious life she had become used to. But staying felt unbearable. Amarachi never thought she would betray her marriage so boldly, but the moment she met Andrew, she knew she was in trouble. He was Richard's new driver, 27 years old, tall, muscular, and full of life. Andrew was charming. He had a smile that made Amarachi's heart race and a voice that sent shivers down her spine. At first, it was just harmless glances and admiration, but soon she found herself longing for his touch, for the passion she had never felt with Richard. She was falling deeply for Andrew, her husband's driver. He was the kind of man she wanted. Tall, dark, and handsome. And he was young. One evening, after Richard had left for a business meeting, Amarachi sat by the pool, pretending to enjoy the fresh air. Andrew was washing one of the cars, his shirt clinging to his body from the water. Amarachi couldn't help but look at him. She beckoned him closer, instructing him to fetch a bottle of wine from the bar. As he handed her the glass, their hands touched briefly, sending a jolt through her, a feeling she had never experienced with her husband. She didn't withdraw. Instead, she locked eyes with him and softly murmured, "Don't go." That evening, under the warm glow of the chandelier, Amarachi tasted passion for the first time. What started as a one-time mistake quickly turned into a dangerous affair. Amarachi and Andrew stole moments whenever Richard was away, meeting in secret corners of the house and taking risks that made her heart pound. She knew she was playing with fire, but she didn't care. For the first time, she felt alive. And with every passing day, the thought of Richard standing between her and true happiness made her hatred for him grow even stronger. She didn't just want freedom anymore. She wanted him gone. Forever. Amarachi's affair with Andrew became the only thing that kept her sane. Every stolen moment with him made her realize just how much she hated being Richard's wife. She no longer cared about hiding her feelings. She was reckless, desperate for something real. But each time she returned to her bedroom, where Richard lay snoring beside her, reality hit her hard. She was still trapped. She wanted more than secret kisses and hurried nights. She wanted a future where she didn't have to sneak around, a future where she and Andrew could be together without fear. One night, as she lay in bed, an idea formed in her mind. If Richard was out of the picture, everything he owned would be hers. She could sell his businesses, keep the money, and start a new life with Andrew. The thought excited her, but it also scared her. Could she really do it? Could she really take a life? She turned to look at Richard, sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that his wife was plotting his death. Amarachi's hands trembled as she imagined it. The next day, she told her plan to Andrew. He stared at her, shocked. "You want to kill your husband?" he asked in a low voice. Amarachi nodded, gripping his hand tightly. "It's the only way," she said. "Once he's gone, we could be together. We won't have to hide anymore." Andrew hesitated, but the promise of wealth and a life with Amarachi was too tempting. "How do we do it?" he finally asked. Amarachi smiled, her mind already working. "Leave that to me," she whispered. "I'll make sure no one ever suspects us." Amarachi knew she had to be very careful. Richard was a public figure, and if anything suspicious happened to him, the police would investigate thoroughly. So she thought of different ways to make his death look natural. Poison seemed like the safest option, slow, untraceable, and effective. She started adding small amounts of it to his evening tea, watching as he grew weaker each day. At first, Richard thought it was just stress, complaining of headaches and dizziness. But as time passed, he became too weak to even leave the house. Amarachi played the role of a caring wife, pretending to be worried while secretly waiting for the poison to finish its work. Andrew grew impatient. "Are you sure this is working?" he asked Amarachi one afternoon. "It's taking too long." Amarachi sighed, frustrated. "We have to be careful. If he dies too suddenly, they'll suspect something." But inside, she was growing tired of waiting too. The thought of being with Andrew, finally free from her miserable marriage, made her even more desperate. That evening, she decided to increase the dosage. Richard barely finished his tea before collapsing on the couch. His breathing was slow, his eyes rolling back. Amarachi held his hand, pretending to panic as she called his name. By the time the doctor arrived, Richard was gone. The funeral was grand, attended by politicians, business tycoons, and wealthy friends. Amarachi wore a black designer lace dress, crying softly as she stood beside Richard's coffin. She played the role of a grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences. But deep inside, she was already planning her new life. That night, as she lay in her large bed alone, for the first time, she smiled. Richard was gone. The wealth was hers. And soon, she and Andrew would be together forever. So she thought. A week after Richard's death, Amarachi was finally ready to take full control of his wealth. She sat in the lawyer's office, expecting to hear about the millions she now owned. Andrew was waiting outside in the car, eager to celebrate once she confirmed that everything was in her name. The lawyer, a serious-looking man in his 50s, cleared his throat as he pulled out some documents. "Mrs. Richard, I have reviewed all of Richard's financial records, and I need to be honest with you." Amarachi sat up, eager to hear the good news. "Your husband was broke." Amarachi frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Richard was a billionaire." The lawyer shook his head. He was in serious debt. He had taken huge loans from the bank to keep up his business, and everything he owned, the mansion, the cars, the company, was used as collateral. Now that he's gone, his creditors will claim everything to recover their money. "You're left with nothing. Didn't he tell you about this?" the lawyer asked. Amarachi's heart started pounding. "That's not possible," she whispered. She had killed him for the money, and now she was hearing there was no money at all. She felt dizzy, her world crashing around her. She stormed out of the office, her hands shaking as she got into the car. "What happened?" Andrew asked, sensing her distress. She looked at him, her face pale. "Richard doesn't have any money," she choked out. "He was drowning in debt. Everything is gone." Andrew's expression changed instantly. "So, you did all this for nothing?" he muttered, anger flashing in his eyes. "We are both in this together," Amarachi said. "But I wasn't the one who killed her husband by poisoning him," Andrew replied. For the first time, Amarachi felt true fear. This was when it dawned on her that she had lost everything. And worse, she had just turned the only man who knew the secret into her biggest enemy. Amarachi could see the anger in Andrew's eyes as he gripped the steering, his knuckles turning white. "You told me this would make us rich," he said in a low, dangerous voice. Amarachi swallowed hard, her palms sweating. "I didn't know, Andrew. I thought." Andrew let out a bitter laugh. "You thought? You killed your husband for nothing." His voice was cold, different from the man she knew. Amarachi reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Andrew, please. We still have each other." He shook his head, staring straight ahead. "No, you have nothing. And now I have nothing too." He started the car and drove off in silence, his mind clearly elsewhere. That night, Amarachi sat alone in her now empty mansion. The bank had already sent notices. She had only a few weeks before they repossessed everything. She tried calling Andrew, but he didn't answer. Panic settled in her chest. She had trusted him, but now he was slipping away. She had no money, no husband, and soon, no home. And worst of all, Andrew knew her secret. If he turned against her, everything would be over. Days passed, and Amarachi's fears grew worse. Andrew refused to see her, and when he finally picked up her call, his words were cold. "I need money. 50 million. Amarachi sighed. "Andrew, I told you I don't have any." There was a long pause. Then his voice came back, calm but full of threat. "Then find a way to get it, or I tell the police everything." Amarachi fell to the floor, tears running down her cheeks. One moment, she had been dreaming of a life of wealth and freedom. Now, she was being blackmailed by the man she thought was in love with her. She knew she had to act fast. She wasn't going to let Andrew ruin her now. If he was a threat, there was only one way to handle him. Just like she had done with Richard, she would have to get rid of Andrew. Permanently. Amarachi knew Andrew well enough to predict his moves. If there was anything she had learned about him during the time of their affair, is that he was very impatient. If he was threatening her, that means he meant it. So, she set a trap. She called him and agreed to meet at a private location, a small house on the outskirts of the city that Richard had once used for quiet getaways. "I have the money," she whispered over the phone. "Meet me there tonight." Andrew agreed instantly. She arrived first at the location, making sure everything was ready. The plan was simple. She had taken her late husband's old gun, which was still in the house. She would wait for Andrew, lure him inside, and when he least expected it, pull the trigger. It was risky, but she had no other choice. If he went to the police, she would go to jail for the murder of her husband. As the night grew darker, she sat in the dimly lit room. She held the gun in her shaking hands. She heard a car pull up outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open, and Andrew stepped in. He looked around, suspicious. "Where's the money?" he asked. Amarachi forced a smile, stepping closer. "It's right here," she said softly, reaching behind her back for the gun. But before she could grab it, Andrew lunged at her. "Did you really think I would trust you? A woman that poisoned her husband, so she will inherit his money," he hissed. Amarachi gasped as he pinned her against the wall, his hands tightening around her throat. She had underestimated him. Now, she was the one fighting for her life. Amarachi struggled against Andrew's grip, gasping for air as his hands tightened around her throat. She clawed at his arms, kicking wildly, but he was stronger. His face was twisted with anger, his teeth clenched. "You think you can play games with me?" he growled. "You killed your husband, and now you want to kill me too." She felt her vision blur, her strength fading. Desperate, she reached for the small table beside her and grabbed the nearest object, a glass vase. With the last of her strength, she smashed it against Andrew's head. He staggered back, cursing in pain, giving her just enough time to grab the gun from behind her. She pointed it at him with trembling hands. "Stay back," she screamed, coughing as she caught her breath. Andrew wiped the blood from his forehead, his eyes dark with fury. "You don't have the guts, Amarachi." He took a slow step forward, testing her. Her hand shook, but she didn't lower the gun. "I will shoot you, Andrew," she warned. He smirked. "Then do it." For a moment, everything was silent. Then Amarachi closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. A loud gunshot echoed in the small house, followed by a heavy thud. She opened her eyes to see Andrew on the floor, blood spreading beneath him. Her hands trembled as she dropped the gun. She had done it. Again. She stood frozen, staring at Andrew's lifeless body. She had killed 2 men in the space of weeks. She felt horrible and guilty, but now wasn't the time to wallow in sorrow. She had to think fast. The police would come if anyone heard the gunshot. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice shaking. The person on the other end hesitated before answering. "I'll be there soon." Within an hour, a man arrived, a fixer, someone Richard had used in the past to clean up messes. He surveyed the scene and shook his head. "You're getting sloppy, madam," he muttered. Amarachi ignored him. "Can you take care of it or not?" He sighed. "It will cost you." She gritted her teeth. "Just do it." He nodded and got to work. As she left the house, she felt a strange emptiness inside. Richard was dead. Andrew was dead. And now, she was truly alone. She had killed for a life of wealth and happiness, but instead, all she had was fear and regret. She drove back to the house, her hands gripping the steering tightly. She had covered her tracks, but for how long? The weight of her crimes was beginning to crush her. Days later, Amarachi tried to go on with her life as if nothing had happened, but trouble was already brewing. The police showed up at her house, asking questions about Andrew. His family reported him missing. One of the officers said, "We understand he worked for your late husband." Amarachi forced a sad smile. "Yes, but I haven't seen him in days. I assumed he quit." The officers didn't look convinced. "Do you mind if we ask your staff a few questions?" Amarachi's heart pounded, but she nodded calmly. Of course. She watched nervously as the police questioned the maid, the security guard, and even the cook. "If you hear anything, let us know," one of them said before walking away. As soon as they were gone, Amarachi locked herself in her room and let out a shaky breath. They were already watching her. It was only a matter of time before they found something. She had done everything to erase the evidence, but she couldn't erase the truth. The walls were closing in, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep running. Amarachi couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jump. Every knock on the door sent shivers down her spine. She had gotten away with Richard's murder, but Andrew's disappearance had put her under the police radar. She needed to be careful. But just when she thought things couldn't get worse, something happened that made her blood run cold. One evening, as she sat alone in the house, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered. "Hello." There was silence for a few seconds, then a deep voice spoke. "You thought you could get away with it?" Amarachi's heart stopped. "Who is this?" she whispered, gripping the phone tightly. The voice chuckled darkly. "You killed Richard and Andrew. You thought no one knew." She dropped the phone, her hands shaking. Who was this person? Could it be someone from the police? Or was it someone connected to Andrew? She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. Aside the man she called to get rid of Andrew's body, no one else knew. And he was someone she trusted not to betray her. So who was this? Amarachi knew she couldn't wait to find out who was after her. She had to act fast. She gathered whatever cash she could find, packed a small bag, and called taxi. She would leave the country, disappear before the police or this mysterious caller could catch up with her. But as she stepped out of the house, a black car pulled up in front of her gate. Two men in suits got out. She turned to run, but another car blocked her from behind. The men walked toward her. "Mrs. Richard, we need you to come with us," one of them said. Amarachi shook her head. "I don't know who you are. Leave me alone." The man pulled out his ID card. "We're from the police." Amarachi's stomach dropped. They had her. She was shoved into the back of the car, her hands trembling as they drove away. She had been so careful, so sure she could outsmart them. Amarachi sat in the interrogation room, staring at the table. Across from her, a detective flipped through a file. "We have enough evidence to charge you," he said. "You poisoned Richard, your late husband. Your affair with Andrew and how you murdered him. And we have proof." Amarachi swallowed hard. "What proof?" she asked, trying to stay calm. The detective smirked and placed a recording device on the table. He pressed play. Andrew's voice filled the room. "She killed Richard. Now she's trying to kill me too." Amarachi's eyes widened in shock. "That's not possible," she stammered. The detective leaned forward. "Andrew knew you might betray him. He recorded this before meeting you that night. He sent it to a friend. That friend sent it to us." Amarachi's whole body went numb. Andrew had outsmarted her, even in death. The walls around her were crumbling. She had no way out. Amarachi sat in the courtroom, wearing handcuffs as the judge read her sentence. "For the murder of Richard Williams and Andrew Okafor, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the gavel striking. It was over. As she was led away, she thought of how different her life could have been. She had wanted wealth, freedom, and love. But instead, she had lost everything. The luxury, the dreams of a future with Andrew, it had all crumbled into dust. Sitting alone in her prison cell that night, she finally accepted the truth. She had killed for money that never existed. And now, she would spend the rest of her life paying the price. Do you think Amarachi got what she deserves? Leave your thoughts in the comment section. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in my next story.